Every small town has a story meant to scare teenagers away from sneaking out at night. A whispered legend passed down through generations, often dismissed as nothing more than campfire material. But the tale of the Hookman has always stood out, because unlike ghost stories and shadows in the woods, this one feels disturbingly human. And the scariest monsters are often the ones who wear human skin. The story begins on a summer evening, warm and heavy with the kind of air that clings to your skin. A teenage boy and girl had borrowed the family car to escape the noise of home and school, looking for some privacy far from the main streets. The boy was proud of the car, though it wasn't much, an older sedan with a faint rattle when it started. Still, it was his ticket to freedom, and she had agreed to come along. They drove aimlessly for a while. The windows cracked just enough to let in the scent of cut grass and the faraway hum of cicadas. Eventually, he steered the car toward the edge of town, where a narrow dirt road led to what was known among local kids as the Lover's Lane. Everyone knew about it, though no one admitted they went there. It was a secluded spot hidden by a line of old trees, a place that seemed designed for secrets. He parked under the shadow of a bent oak tree, and for a moment, it was just the two of them, suspended in the kind of silence you only notice when you're away from civilization. The headlights dimmed, leaving behind only faint moonlight. The boy turned the radio on low, letting soft music fill the background, though even that couldn't completely cover the quiet unease that sometimes settles and when you realize just how far from anyone else you really are. They talked in hushed voices, laughing softly, but the mood changed the moment the radio was interrupted. A stiff, official voice broke through the music with an emergency bulletin. The announcer explained that a man had escaped from the nearby state psychiatric hospital. He was considered extremely dangerous. The warning described him in unsettling detail, tall, broad-shouldered, his most striking feature being the prosthetic hook that replaced his right hand. The message urged residents to remain indoors, lock their doors, and report any suspicious activity. The boy quickly reached forward and clicked the radio off. He chuckled nervously and told her it was nothing, just a kind of broadcast meant to keep people alert. But she didn't laugh. Her hands tightened in her lap, and she glanced toward the dark woods that surrounded the car. She whispered that maybe they shouldn't stay. At first, he teased her for being scared, but her voice carried a kind of seriousness he hadn't expected. She insisted that this was not the night to be sitting in an empty clearing, far from town, with only trees and shadows for company. She pointed out that they were in exactly the type of place someone dangerous would go if they wanted to avoid being seen. The boy was about to argue again when a sound cut through their quiet debate. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, the faint scrape of something against metal. The girl froze instantly, her breath catching as her eyes darted toward the car window. The boy's jaw tightened. He tried to tell himself it was just a branch in the wind. That was the logical answer. But when the noise came again, slow, deliberate, unmistakable, his explanation felt hollow. He gripped the steering wheel, suddenly aware of how vulnerable they were, sitting in a parked car in the middle of nowhere. The girl whispered that they should leave right now, her voice trembling with urgency. He wanted to be brave, wanted to believe there was nothing out there, but the silence between those noises was worse than the noises themselves. It was as if something was waiting, just beyond their vision. And then there was a different sound, heavier this time, a dull tap, followed by another, as though someone were pressing against the car in the dark. That was enough. The boy twisted the key. The engine sputtered to life, and the car jerked forward. Gravel crunched under the tires as they sped down the dirt road, the branches along the narrow path clawing against the sides of the vehicle. The girl clutched her arms close to her chest, her eyes fixed on the window, as though expecting to see a face appear in the glass. Neither of them spoke a word. It wasn't until they reached the glow of town, with the safety of streetlights washing away the suffocating darkness, that the girl let out a long, shaky breath. She looked at him with wide eyes, as though searching his face for reassurance. He forced a laugh and told her it was probably nothing. An animal, maybe, or the wind. They had just let that radio broadcast get inside their heads. That was all. But the girl didn't look convinced, and truthfully, neither was he. Still, he parked in front of her house, the porch light flickering faintly above the door. He stepped out first, forcing calm into his movements as he walked around to her side to open the door for her. That's when he saw it. Hanging from the passenger side door handle was something that didn't belong. A heavy, rusted piece of metal curved into a hook. Its surface was streaked with something dark, something that caught the porch light and gleamed in a way that made his stomach twist. For a long moment, he just stared. His throat felt tight, his breath shallow. He wanted to tell her to look, but the words stuck. The truth was clear enough. Someone had been there. Someone had been close enough to touch the car, close enough to leave behind proof. And if they had stayed only a little longer, or moved only a little slower, that hook wouldn't be dangling harmlessly on the door. It might have been tearing into the car, or worse. The boy closed the door carefully, his hands trembling as he tried to steady himself. He didn't say anything as he walked her to the porch. Some stories don't need to be spoken out loud, and that's why, even now, the legend of the Hookman still circulates in hushed whispers. It's not just a tale of shadows and fear. It's a reminder that sometimes the scariest things in the world aren't imagined. Sometimes they're real. Sometimes they're standing right outside your door waiting. Some stories are passed down in whispers, the kind that make you hesitate before entering a dark room alone. Among these, few are as notorious as the legend of Bloody Mary, a figure said to appear in mirrors when summoned, a specter of vengeance and sorrow that preys on curiosity and fear. Most dismissed it as a childish dare, a way for teenagers to prove bravery at sleepovers. But like many legends, there are those who know better, those who have looked too long, or called too many times, and regretted it for the rest of their lives. It all begins in a quiet suburban neighborhood during a summer break. A group of friends had gathered at one girl's house, seeking the thrill of rebellion against the rules that governed their world. The parents were away for the evening, leaving the house empty except for the soft hum of the air conditioner and the low chatter of the teens as they explored the house with the casual boredom of youth. The living room was littered with snacks and soda cans, a temporary kingdom of laughter and mischief. And then, inevitably, someone suggested it. Let's try Bloody Mary. At first, it was a joke. They knew the rules by heart. Stand in front of a mirror in a dark room and say her name 3 times. Some versions added a candle, or a spinning motion, or a dare to look past the reflection. Most nights, it was all nonsense. A game meant to scare each other. But this night felt different. There was a stillness in the house, a kind of heaviness in the air that didn't belong. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it made every laugh shorter, every movement slower. The girl leading the challenge dimmed the lights, leaving only a single candle flickering on the bathroom counter. Shadows clung to the corners of the room, stretching unnaturally, as though they were alive. Her friends crowded close, pressing their faces toward the mirror, hearts pounding in anticipation and fear. "Are you sure we should do this?" one of them whispered. "Don't chicken out," the girl said, her voice a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She picked up the challenge without hesitation. Holding the candle between trembling hands, she stared into the mirror, her reflection pale and uncertain. "Bloody Mary," she said softly. Then again, and a third time, her voice cracking slightly on the final word. For a moment, nothing happened. The reflection was exactly as it had always been herself, surrounded by flickering shadows. The group laughed nervously, ready to call it a prank, ready to leave the game behind. But then, in the corner of her vision, she saw it. Something shifting behind her reflection. A movement so subtle she could almost convince herself it was her imagination. And then the face appeared. Pale, hollow, eyes dark and bottomless, staring back from the glass with a mixture of rage and sorrow. The girl froze, unable to look away, unable to speak. The candlelight flickered across her features, and then, just for a heartbeat, it seemed to stretch, to contort into a grimace of anguish and fury. The other teens gasped, some laughing nervously, refusing to admit the fear that was suddenly clawing at their throats. The girl in front of the mirror felt her body lock. She could feel the cold pressing in through the bathroom tiles, a weight on her chest as though the very air had thickened. The eyes in the mirror did not blink. They did not look away. They simply held her in place, a silent accusation, a warning she could not understand but felt deep in her bones. No one spoke for what felt like minutes. Finally, one of the friends whispered, "Stop. Just stop it." But it was too late. The figure in the mirror had grown larger, now taking up more of the reflection than the bathroom should allow. Its hair was wet, clinging to a pale face, and its mouth twisted into a hollow scream that seemed to echo inside the girl's mind rather than her ears. Panic set in. She tried to step back, but the floor felt heavier than it should. Her legs resisted, as if the room itself were holding her there. The friends rushed forward, but even they could not pull her attention from the mirror. It was as if the reflection had swallowed her, and she was trapped in the world on the other side. Then, suddenly, the candle blew out. Darkness filled the room, thick and suffocating. She felt a presence behind her, the air colder than it should be for midsummer. She spun, expecting someone to be playing a cruel trick, but no one was there. Just empty space, stillness, and the echo of her own panicked breathing. When the lights flickered back on moments later, the mirror showed only her reflection, pale and trembling. But she knew. She knew the figure had been there, had stared into her soul. The room carried a residue of that presence, a weight that lingered in corners, in reflections, in the spaces just beyond sight. From that night on, nothing was quite the same. She refused to go near mirrors after dark. Even photographs seemed unsettling, her reflection appearing slightly different, a shadow lingering where none should exist. And sometimes, when the house was quiet, she could swear she saw the same hollow, dark eye staring at her from the glass, even in places where no mirror existed. The legend of Bloody Mary lives on because it preys on curiosity, on the thrill of fear, on the foolish confidence of those who believe they can command what should never be summoned. Some dismiss it as childish nonsense, a game to test courage, but there are always those who have seen her, those who have stared too long, those who have whispered her name and felt the consequences that follow. And once she notices you, the story is no longer a story. It becomes something you live with every time you look into a mirror, every time you catch a reflection out of the corner of your eye. Because the legend isn't just about saying her name. It's about being seen. And some things, once they see you, never forget. It was a rainy night when he first saw her, standing alone on the side of the highway. The kind of night where every headlight reflecting off the wet asphalt seems too bright, and every shadow under the trees seems too dark. He had been driving for hours, the monotonous hum of the tires on the road lulling him into a quiet, almost dreamlike state. The clock on the dashboard read just past midnight. He was tired, but not enough to pull over until he saw her. She was dressed in a pale coat, soaked from the rain, her hair plastered to her face. She looked young, no older than 16 or 17, and she held out her thumb in the universal sign of someone seeking a ride. Her expression was calm, almost serene, but there was something about her that immediately set him on edge. Something fragile, like she didn't quite belong in this world, like she had been misplaced. He hesitated for a long moment, watching her shiver in the rain. Most of him told himself to keep driving, to ignore her, but another part, the part that couldn't leave someone stranded, urged him to stop. He pulled the car to the side, the tires splashing through puddles, and rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" he asked, forcing a casual tone he didn't feel. She nodded silently and climbed in. Her presence filled the car immediately, not in a frightening way, but in a strange, weightless way. It was as if the air itself had changed, thicker, colder, and yet almost sweet, with some indefinable scent of rain and something else he couldn't name. They drove in silence for a few minutes. He tried to make conversation, asked where she was going, what had brought her out here in the middle of a storm, but she only shook her head slightly, staring out the window with wide, dark eyes. Her gaze seemed to see him, but not see him, looking through him as though she were thinking about something far away, something unreachable. The road twisted through empty fields and clusters of trees. Occasionally, the lights of distant houses flickered, but mostly it was just the rain and the occasional flash of passing signs. He felt increasingly uneasy, a subtle gnawing in his stomach that told him something was off. He glanced at her again and realized that she hadn't spoken a single word, hadn't even offered a name. Finally, unable to contain his curiosity, he asked, "Where do you live? I can take you there." She shook her head gently, then extended a hand toward the glove compartment, motioning toward a folded piece of paper. He reached over and opened it, finding an address written in careful, neat handwriting. He swallowed, a chill running down his spine as he recognized the street. It was only a few miles away, but it was a part of town he hadn't thought about in years. He hesitated, then started the car and drove toward the address. The streets were empty, silent except for the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers. Occasionally, he caught glimpses of shadows moving at the edge of the light, but it was always too brief to identify. The girl remained still, staring straight ahead, her eyes never wavering. When he arrived at the house, he slowed the car and glanced over at her. She was gone. The seatbelt sagged beside him. The space where she had been was empty. He blinked and looked around the interior of the car, expecting some trick of the light, some hidden corner where she might be hiding. But there was nothing. Confused and unsettled, he stepped out of the car and walked to the door of the house. It was old, with peeling paint and the faint smell of damp wood. He rang the doorbell. After a moment, an elderly woman opened the door, her face lined with age and sorrow. "I'm sorry to bother you," he began, trying to explain. I picked up your daughter tonight. She was..." The woman's face fell immediately. She shook her head slowly. "My daughter," she said, voice trembling. "My daughter, she died 15 years ago, on this very night, in a car accident, right on the highway where you say you found her." The blood drained from his face. The rain still fell, tapping softly against the roof of his car. He stumbled back, unable to speak, unable to comprehend what he had just experienced. The girl he had given a ride to had been gone for more than a decade. She had looked alive, real, present, yet she had vanished without a trace the moment he arrived at her home. Even now, years later, he can't drive that road after midnight without seeing her, standing there in the rain, her hand raised, waiting for someone to stop. he could still feel her presence, as real as it was that night, sitting silently in his car, staring through him with eyes that had never truly left this world. And some nights, when the wind is just right and the rain falls lightly on the windshield, he swears he can hear the faintest whisper from the back seat. Thank you for the ride. Some nights are ordinary. Ordinary in the sense that nothing remarkable seems to happen. And yet, when the darkness presses against the windows and the wind whispers through the cracks in the house, the ordinary can turn into something you will never forget. This is one of those nights. It begins with a young girl, 17 years old, home alone for the first time in her life. Her parents had gone on a weekend trip to visit relatives in a neighboring town, leaving her the house to herself. She had been thrilled at first: freedom, quiet, and the space to do exactly as she pleased without rules or interruptions. The evening had started with harmless fun. She watched a movie, made herself popcorn, and scrolled through her phone. Outside, the neighborhood had settled into that familiar stillness, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound, like a rustle of leaves or the faint bark of a dog, feel amplified. As the night deepened, she grew slightly uneasy. She told herself it was only the wind, only the creaks that old houses always made. But something felt different. The shadows in the corners of her room seemed too deep, too still. The silence was heavier than usual, carrying a weight she couldn't shake. She tried to focus on the movie, letting the story distract her, but an occasional, faint scratching sound kept pulling her attention back to the room itself. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but enough to make her pause every few minutes, every few seconds, straining her ears in the dark. She reassured herself. She was safe. The doors were locked. The windows were shut. There was nothing to worry about. Eventually, she decided to go to bed. Her room was on the second floor, at the far end of the hallway. She turned off the lights and pulled the covers around her, feeling a momentary comfort in the cocoon of her blankets. Her dog, a loyal German shepherd named Max, lay at the foot of her bed, a silent presence that always made her feel protected. She patted his head and whispered, "Good night, Max. Thanks for keeping me safe." And then it began. She felt it first as a faint, wet sensation on her hand. It was slow, almost gentle, like the tip of a tongue brushing against her skin. She froze, uncertain if her mind was playing tricks. She reached down, brushing her hand over Max, expecting to feel his fur. There was nothing unusual. Max's head rested quietly on the bed, his eyes half closed in sleep. The sensation came again, a deliberate, persistent licking. This time, she sat up, heart pounding, and leaned forward to see her dog, hoping for the comfort of his familiar gaze. Max was lying on the floor beside the bed, completely still, breathing evenly. There was no movement, no sound, nothing to explain the sensation she had just felt. Her mind raced. Maybe it was the wind through the window. Maybe it was a trick of her imagination. Her nerves heightened by being alone for the first time. She tried to convince herself of rational explanations, but the sensation returned, steady and unmistakable. Someone or something was touching her hand. She looked around the room, scanning the shadows, her eyes falling on the corners where darkness pooled. Her mind jumped to the worst-case scenarios, but she fought to keep calm. There was no sound. No one was there. She was alone. She had to be. Trying to calm herself, she slipped out of bed and flipped the light switch. The room filled with a warm glow, but the feeling persisted. It was now accompanied by the faintest movement at the edge of her vision, a shadow, almost imperceptible, lingering just beyond the reach of the light. She forced herself to laugh, nervously shaking her head. "It's nothing," she whispered. "Just nerves." But the wet, deliberate pressure on her hand told her it was far from nothing. She sank back into bed, deciding that if she stayed still, it might stop. The night wore on, the sensation coming and going intermittently, each time more insistent than the last. She tried to sleep, curling tightly beneath the covers, her hand buried beneath the blankets for protection. But she could feel it, the persistent, wet licking, cold and invasive, as though something were testing her, measuring her fear. Morning finally arrived with the soft gray light of dawn filtering through the curtains. She opened her eyes, expecting relief. She wanted relief, but instead, she felt a weight pressing against her chest, a cold, creeping dread that made her stomach turn. Max was still at the foot of the bed, asleep as usual. Relief washed over her momentarily. It had been a nightmare. It had to be. She slid out of bed and turned on the lights fully, trying to chase away the lingering fear. That's when she noticed the front door, slightly ajar. Her parents always locked it before leaving. She remembered turning the key herself. She frowned but assumed the wind might have blown it open. Shaking off the unease, she walked down the stairs. And then she saw Max lying outside in the yard. His body was still. His eyes stared blankly into the sky. Her heart stopped. Panic gripped her throat. She ran toward him, kneeling beside his lifeless body. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to comprehend what had happened. There was no logical explanation, no sign of a struggle, no footprints in the yard, nothing that made sense. That's when she noticed it. A message, written across the wall near the door. Words scratched deep into the paint. "Humans can lick too." She stumbled backward, horror overwhelming her, unable to comprehend how the words could appear, how the hand that wrote them could have moved so silently, so deliberately. Through the house, she thought she knew. Even now, years later, she can't be alone in a house without feeling that presence. Mirrors, blankets, shadows. Anything that brushes against her skin feels suspicious. She lives with the memory of that night permanently etched into her mind. The knowledge that the world is far stranger, far darker than she could have ever imagined. And sometimes, when she's home alone and the wind howls just right, she swears she can feel it again. The wet, deliberate touch, testing, waiting. Because that night taught her something every teenager should fear. Sometimes, what you trust to protect you is gone, and the thing that watches you from the dark, it is very much real. She had been babysitting for years, though this particular house felt different, large and slightly intimidating. It sat at the end of a quiet suburban street, surrounded by tall oaks whose branches scraped against the windows when the wind picked up. She knew the rules. Stay in the living room, keep the children occupied, and don't let them wander too far. Tonight, the parents had gone out for a late dinner, leaving her in charge of 2 young children, an energetic 6-year-old boy and a 4-year-old girl. At first, everything seemed normal. She played games with the children, read them stories, and tucked them into bed at their usual time. The house fell silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. She settled into the living room with a book, the soft glow of the lamp offering comfort against the encroaching darkness of the night. Then the phone rang. The shrill sound startled her, echoing through the empty house. Picking up the receiver, she said politely, "Hello." There was a pause, and then a quiet, raspy voice asked, "Have you checked the children?" She laughed nervously, assuming it was a prank call. "Yes, I've already put them to bed," she replied, trying to sound confident. The caller hung up. She set the phone down, shaking her head at her imagination. But it rang again a few minutes later, The same question repeated in the same eerie tone. By the third call, she felt unease settling in her stomach. The voice was deliberate, insistent, and almost amused by her nervousness. She tried calling the number back, only to hear a recorded message saying the line was disconnected. Her mind raced. Who could be calling? It had to be a joke. Yet something about the voice, low, patient, and strangely intimate, made her skin crawl. She double-checked the children, peering into their rooms. They were sound asleep, tucked under blankets, the boy clutching his favorite stuffed animal. The girl's tiny hand rested on the pillow, her breathing even and calm. Nothing seemed amiss. And yet, the next call came. Same voice, same words. Fear began to take root. She felt trapped, alone in the vast house, with the shadows suddenly seeming longer and darker than before. The lamp flickered briefly, and she noticed a chill in the air that hadn't been there moments ago. Her heart thumped loudly, though she tried to convince herself to stay calm. Then a new thought struck her. What if the calls weren't a joke? What if someone was in the house? She picked up the phone, holding it tightly, and said softly, "Hello? Who is this?" The line went dead. Determined to maintain control, she quietly moved through the house, checking doors and windows, locking each one as she went. The front door, the back door, the sliding glass to the patio, all secure. She returned to the living room, trying to gather her courage. Her mind kept returning to the voice on the phone, taunting her with its simple question, "Have you checked the children?" Moments later, the phone rang again. Her hand shook as she answered. This time, the voice said more clearly, almost with amusement, "I'm right behind you." She froze, unable to move, every instinct screaming at her to flee. Her eyes darted toward the stairs leading to the bedrooms, and then the sound of quiet movement from the hallway made her heart leap into her throat. Adrenaline surged as she realized the truth. The calls were not coming from outside the house. With trembling hands, she ran to the front door, yanking it open, but the street was empty. No cars, no passerby, just a quiet suburban night, deceptively peaceful. She slammed the door shut, leaned against it, and tried to steady her breathing. The phone rang once more. She didn't pick it up. Instead, she ran to the living room and grabbed a nearby baseball bat, her eyes scanning every shadow. The calls stopped, but she could feel it, the presence in the house, patient and deliberate. Eventually, the parents returned home. She rushed to greet them, breathless, her voice shaking as she recounted the night's events. The father immediately called the police. When officers arrived, they traced the calls, only to find the chilling truth. The calls had all originated from the very same house she had been babysitting in. The line had not been hacked, nor misdialed. Someone or something inside the house had been watching, testing her, tormenting her. Even years later, she avoids babysitting at night, and every time she hears a quiet knock or the faint ring of a phone, her mind replays those words in the same raspy, patient tone. "Have you checked the children?" Some legends are rooted in truth, and some truths become legends. On Staten Island, there's been a story whispered for generations, one that begins in the dark corners of abandoned buildings, in the forests that border suburban streets, and in the cautionary tales parents tell their children at night. The name is Cropsey, and whether you consider him myth or reality, his presence has haunted the island for decades. It was a late summer evening when a group of children decided to explore the wooded area behind their neighborhood. They had grown up hearing the warnings, of course. Parents told stories of Cropsey, a man said to live in the forest, carrying a rusty hook or an axe, sometimes described as an escaped mental patient, other times as a homeless madman who kidnapped children who wandered too far. The details varied, but the message was always the same. Stay inside at night, or Cropsey will find you. Despite the warnings, the children were drawn to the thrill of danger. They moved quietly through the trees, their flashlights sweeping over gnarled roots and moss-covered rocks. The woods seemed alive with shadows, stretching longer than they should, moving just out of the corner of their eyes. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves sent their hearts racing, but the bravest among them pressed on. As darkness fell, they discovered an old, abandoned hospital building at the edge of the woods. Its windows were shattered, the brick walls blackened with age and neglect. They joked nervously about Cropsey lurking inside, but the air grew colder, and the wind seemed to whisper warnings they couldn't understand. One by one, they hesitated at the threshold, the thrill of adventure giving way to the growing weight of unease. Hours later, in a nearby neighborhood, residents reported seeing a figure moving through the streets at the edges of the dim streetlights. A tall man with ragged clothes, a crooked walk, and a wild glint in his eyes. He carried something metallic that caught the light, though it was impossible to tell exactly what it was. Children who glimpsed him swore he stared directly at them, unblinking, his expression empty yet terrifying. One night, a teenage boy was walking home from a friend's house when he noticed the figure. He froze, realizing that the figure was following him at a distance, keeping pace without haste, yet never leaving him alone. Panic surged. He broke into a run, weaving through alleys and side streets. But the figure was always there, a silent predator who seemed to know every turn he would take. When he finally reached his front door and slammed it behind him, he could still see Cropsey in the distance, standing under a flickering street lamp, watching him retreat into the safety of his home. Stories of Cropsey were no longer limited to whispers in the neighborhood. During the 1970s and 1980s, actual disappearances of children in Staten Island fueled the legend, giving it a chilling weight of reality. People began to link the urban legend to real-life events, missing kids, strange sightings, and reports of a mysterious figure lurking near schools and playgrounds. The tales described him differently, sometimes a man with a hook, sometimes with a long knife. But the core of the legend remained consistent. Cropsey hunts the unwary, waiting for a single mistake, a single moment of vulnerability. Parents tightened their rules. Children were instructed to stay in groups, to avoid certain streets, to never walk alone after dark. But curiosity is a stubborn thing. Even the bravest would sneak a peek down a deserted street, or venture a little farther into the woods, testing the boundaries of the warnings. And when they did, some claimed they saw him. The tall, unkempt figure, always watching, always waiting, his presence lingering even after he had vanished into the shadows. Locals who grew up with the stories report that even as adults, the memory of Cropsey never fades. Passing by the woods at night, they feel a shiver, a sudden sense that something is following. Forgotten buildings, empty streets, the rustle of leaves. These ordinary things can conjure the legend, making it real again in their minds. Whether Cropsey ever truly existed or is simply a cautionary tale stretched across decades, one thing remains certain. The fear he inspires is real. The cautionary warnings that parents pass on, the stories whispered in dark bedrooms, and the vigilance taught to every child who ventures near the woods. All of it is born from a primal understanding that some dangers are better left unexplored. Because in the shadows of Staten Island, Cropsey waits, always waiting. Some nights, the world feels ordinary. Streets glow under the pale sweep of streetlights. The air carries the familiar sense of grass, asphalt, and the occasional distant smoke. But there are moments when something ordinary becomes terrifying. when the familiar folds into the unknown, and the ordinary streets you trust become the stage for something you cannot explain. He had been driving home late one night after a long shift, the kind of night where fatigue dulls the mind, and the world becomes a blur of dim streetlights and passing cars. The roads were mostly empty, the silence stretching between occasional houses. He kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting lightly on the gearshift, his thoughts drifting toward home and a warm bed waiting at the end of the commute. Then he saw them, 2 children standing at the side of the road, just beyond the faint glow of a street lamp. At first, he thought they must have been waiting for someone, maybe a parent or a friend, but something about them immediately unsettled him. They were pale, unnaturally so, and their clothing was outdated, ill-fitting, as though they had been dressed by someone with no regard for style or comfort. They stood unnaturally still, almost rigid, and their eyes, he could not see their eyes. The pupils, the irises, everything was black. Solid, unbroken darkness that swallowed the light and reflected nothing back. His hands tightened on the wheel. Every rational thought screamed at him to keep driving, to ignore them, to leave them there. But an instinct far deeper, older, warned him to stop. The children raised a hand simultaneously, a small, deliberate gesture that was almost imperceptible, yet somehow commanding. Against every instinct, he slowed, rolling to a stop a few feet from them. The air in the car seemed to grow heavier, pressing against his chest. He cleared his throat, forcing a casual tone. "Hey, do you need a ride?" The older one, a boy perhaps no more than 12, stepped forward slightly. His voice was soft, deliberate, and yet carried a tone of authority that was impossible for one so young to project. "Please, can we come with you?" The man's stomach clenched. Something was wrong. He felt it, a deep, unsettling sense that these children were not simply lost or in need of help. He couldn't explain it, not logically. Their eyes, impossibly black, seemed to pierce into his very soul. His limbs felt heavier, his thoughts sluggish, as though the world itself were bending toward them, pulling him into a decision he did not want to make. He hesitated. I don't think that's a good idea. It's late. You should." The girl, smaller and quieter, took a step closer. Her voice was even softer, almost a whisper, but it carried the same unnerving authority. "Please, we won't be any trouble. We just need a ride." There was something in the air now, a subtle pressure that made the hair on his arms stand on end. It was as if the children were feeding off his fear, drawing it closer, and with every heartbeat, the darkness in their eyes seemed to grow heavier, more commanding. He could feel it pressing on him, not outside, but inside, shaping his thoughts, compelling him toward a choice he knew was wrong. He slammed the accelerator and drove past them. His hand shook, adrenaline mixing with terror. His headlights passed over their still figures, frozen at the roadside, their hands lowering slowly, but never leaving his mind. Even after he turned a corner and tried to convince himself they were gone, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Days later, he told a friend about the encounter. The friend laughed nervously and said he had heard similar stories of black-eyed children who appear at night, asking for rides or entry into homes. People report the same compulsion, the same growing unease. Those who refuse are often left shaken for days, haunted by the memory of those eyes, by the feeling that something unnatural tried to cross into their world. Those who let them in are never seen again. The legend is not confined to one street, one city, or one country. Sightings have been reported across America, in isolated towns and major cities alike. The children are always pale, always black-eyed, always silent or whispering in unnerving tones that demand attention. They knock on doors, appear in driveways, or stand silently on curbs, waiting for someone to give in to the compulsion, to let them cross the threshold. Some witnesses describe a moment when time itself seems to bend, a short period where rational thought fails, and the mind struggles to resist the insistence of their voices. A subtle unease becomes an unbearable pressure, a pull that feels like gravity itself, coaxing the observer toward the wrong decision. It is never loud, never overt. It is insidious, intimate, and deeply, fundamentally unnatural. The man who encountered them never drove that street again after nightfall. Even in daylight, he avoided that neighborhood. He reports that sometimes, in reflective surfaces, shop windows, mirrors, even car windows, he sees a pair of black eyes staring back, distant but unmistakable. And he knows, with a certainty that chills him even now, that if he had stopped, if he had let them in, he would not be here to tell the story. Some nights, when the wind shifts in a certain way and shadows creep long across the pavement, he feels it, the lingering presence of those black-eyed children, a quiet, patient reminder that some things should never be invited in. Some things should remain on the curb, waiting for the next passerby who doesn't know the rules. And in that lingering darkness, he knows the legend is more than a story. It is a warning. He first noticed him on a gray autumn afternoon, walking through the dense forest near the edge of town, the kind of forest that stretched for miles, full of thick trees, whose branches tangled together to block sunlight, leaving the ground in constant shadow. The boy had gone out for a hike, seeking solitude and a brief escape from the noise of home. He had been warned not to wander too far, but curiosity had always been stronger than caution. At first, it was only a sense. The forest was quiet, eerily quiet, and though he told himself it was just the natural hush of trees and fallen leaves, something felt wrong. He stopped to catch his breath and noticed the first oddity. A figure in the distance, impossibly tall, pale, and thin, standing motionless among the trees. Its suit was black formal, as if it had been plucked from another era, and its face, or lack thereof, was featureless. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a blank, smooth expanse of pale skin. He froze, heart hammering. The figure did not move, but its presence was oppressive, as though the forest itself had shifted to make room for it. He told himself to run, to turn back, but when he did, the figure was closer, impossibly closer. Each step he took forward, it mirrored, silent and deliberate. There was no rustle of leaves, no breaking of twigs. It simply existed, an unnatural presence that seemed to warp the very space around it. The boy turned, sprinting through the underbrush, feeling branches whip against his arms and face. He could hear nothing but his own ragged breathing, yet the figure followed effortlessly. When he glanced over his shoulder, it seemed to glide, long limbs stretching unnaturally, weaving through trees without touching a single branch. Panic gave way to raw terror. He had heard stories, old legends whispered among kids at school, but they were always dismissed as myth. Now he understood how easy it was for fiction to feel like reality when faced with something entirely beyond human comprehension. He reached the edge of the forest as dusk fell, hoping for the safety of open streets. The figure was nowhere in sight, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that it had not left, that it lingered just beyond the trees, watching, waiting. He ran the rest of the way home, shutting the door behind him and collapsing against it, trembling. That night, sleep was impossible. Shadows seemed to stretch across the walls of his room, and every creak of the house made him flinch. He swore he saw movement outside the window, slender limbs appearing among the branches, the faceless figure still waiting, patient, silent. Days passed. but the sense of being watched persisted. He avoided the forest entirely, sticking to busy streets in daylight, yet he would catch glimpses of long, black shapes in corners of his vision, gone when he turned to face them. He began noticing small things at home. Objects slightly moved, scratches along the door frames, a faint coldness lingering near corners. Each incident seemed minor, but together they formed a pattern, a quiet assertion that he was never truly alone. As the weeks went on, he began researching the legend. Slender Man, the faceless stalker of children, a being born from the fear of the unknown. Stories described his ability to manipulate reality, to appear and vanish at will, to control minds, to drive those who saw him into madness. The more he read, the more he realized that every account shared the same characteristics: tall, unnaturally thin, faceless, formal in attire, capable of following without being seen, and always patient. The boy began to notice changes in himself. Nightmares came first, long, dreamless stretches where he could feel Slender Man moving through his bedroom, touching the corners of his mind. Then waking dreams, hallucinations that blurred the line between night and day. Shadows moved unnaturally, doors seemed slightly off their hinges, and the sensation of something behind him never disappeared. It became a constant, oppressive presence, shaping his perception of reality. Eventually, he confided in friends, showing them photographs and sketches of what he had seen. Many dismissed it, claiming stress or imagination, but some began reporting their own encounters. Black suits glimpsed in alleyways, impossible shadows bending over schoolyards, the unshakable feeling of being followed. The legend was growing, evolving, feeding on fear, and the boy realized with growing horror that it thrived on the attention, on belief. He tried to flee the town, to escape the forest, to leave the streets he had walked since childhood, but Slender Man followed. Every unfamiliar road, every hotel at the edge of a new city, every moment of solitude. The figure was there, silent, patient, faceless. His friends, too, began vanishing in small, unexplained incidents. The boy's nights were sleepless, his days consumed by paranoia. He could never let his guard down. He could never be alone. And then came the letters. Short, typed notes slipped under doors, folded and left on car seats, always unsigned. We're watching. We're waiting. Each one brought the same cold certainty. The figure was patient, and patience was the most terrifying weapon of all. He began avoiding mirrors, fearing the faint reflection of the faceless stalker might appear behind him. He stopped taking photos, deleted old images, moved furniture to block views from windows. Nothing seemed to matter. The presence was constant, invasive, intimate, a reminder that some things are unstoppable, that some fears cannot be outrun. Years later, he is still haunted, still fleeing, still aware of the cold impossibility of Slender Man's patience. Even in crowded streets, he can feel the weight of impossibly long limbs, hear the quiet patience pressing against the edges of his mind. And though the figure never speaks, never moves in ways humans recognize, he knows it is always there, watching, waiting, patient, relentless, and always faceless. Because Slender Man is not just a legend. He is proof that fear can become flesh, that patience can become a predator, and that the things born from the darkest corners of the mind are often the ones most real in the end. It was one of those nights where the darkness feels heavier than usual, pressing down through the streetlights and creeping into every shadowed corner. She had just finished a late shift and was eager to get home, craving the comfort of her apartment and the normalcy of routine. The roads were nearly empty, stretching ahead in quiet monotony. Her car hummed along the asphalt, tires whispering over cracks and worn patches, the only sounds being the soft music she had left on and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees lining the streets. At first, she noticed a car behind her only casually. It was a sedan, older model, its headlights dim and uneven. She assumed it was someone heading the same way, perhaps just a commuter like her. But as she drove, the car stayed unusually close, keeping pace with her. Each time she changed lanes, it mirrored her movement almost perfectly. Her chest tightened slightly, a small seed of unease taking root, but she dismissed it. It was probably coincidence, she told herself, nothing more. Then came the first instinctive warning, a flicker of movement in her rearview mirror, something too deliberate to be casual, a shadow shifting, a silhouette that seemed almost human but moved with a silent patience that made her stomach knot. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was her imagination, that her mind was tired and overreacting. But the unease only grew. She took a turn onto a quieter street, hoping to lose the car. The headlights behind her appeared to hesitate for a moment, and then followed. That's when she remembered the old warnings from childhood. Stories of killers hiding in back seats, waiting for the right moment when you least suspected. A cold wave of fear washed over her, and she glanced toward the back seat reflexively, almost afraid of what she might see. The interior was dark, empty, or so it seemed. Her eyes strained to adjust, scanning every shadowed corner, every fold of the seat. Nothing. She exhaled shakily and tried to rationalize her fear. The car behind her would be gone soon. The tension would dissolve, and it would just be another late-night drive. But the feeling didn't leave. It grew stronger, heavier, as if something in the car itself was waiting. She felt her pulse accelerate, her palms sweat against the steering wheel. Every instinct screamed at her to stop, to check, to run, but she couldn't find the courage. She thought of her apartment, safe and familiar, and tried to focus on reaching it. Another movement caught her eye, a brief flicker from the corner of her vision. She dared a glance over her shoulder. That's when she saw it. A hand, pale and large, resting lightly on the back of the driver's seat. Her blood ran cold. She couldn't scream. She couldn't think. The hand was there, deliberate, impossible in its casual menace. Adrenaline surged. She slammed the accelerator and swerved toward a well-lit gas station that loomed ahead, desperate for any sign of safety. The car behind her slowed, its headlights disappearing into the darkness, swallowed by the shadows of the empty streets. Her knees shook as she parked, fumbling to lock the doors, not daring to check the back seat until she was certain the danger had passed. When she did, she found nothing. The seat was empty, the space behind her unoccupied. Trembling, she told herself it had been a hallucination, a trick of tired eyes. She tried to calm herself, stepping into the gas station under harsh fluorescent lights, but the terror clung to her like a second skin. Returning home did little to soothe her. That night, sleep was impossible. Every sound, the creak of the radiator, the hum of distant traffic, made her flinch. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward her. She replayed the image of that hand over and over, unable to comprehend what she had seen or why it had vanished so completely. Over the next few nights, she became hyper-aware of her surroundings. Mirrors reflected shadows that didn't belong. Glimpses in the rearview mirror made her jump. Every back seat she passed, every empty passenger side chair, brought a shiver of recognition. Her friends dismissed her fears, laughing nervously, but she knew. She had felt it. She had seen the hand, the lingering threat, the quiet presence of someone, or something, that could have been right behind her at any moment. Weeks later, she discovered faint scratches on the passenger seat, small but deep enough to leave marks. Dark smudges traced the contours of the seat, suggesting someone or something had moved there. The rational part of her mind tried to dismiss it, but the instinctive terror never faded. She began double-checking her car before driving, scanning the back seat obsessively, locking doors even when she parked inside her apartment complex. Even now, months later, she avoids driving alone at night. She keeps the windows up, the doors locked, her eyes constantly scanning the mirrors. Every small shadow, every unexpected movement reminds her of that night, of the hand that could have reached out in silence, of the car that followed her and vanished into the darkness, patient and unseen. Some fears are not lessons, they are reminders. Reminders that the world can harbor quiet, patient dangers, that ordinary streets can conceal extraordinary evil, and that sometimes the person or thing waiting for the wrong moment is closer than you think. She knows it, and every time she drives at night, she feels it again. The cold, deliberate presence of the hand on the seat behind her, waiting for her to let her guard down. Because some warnings are real, and some nightmares never leave. No matter how far you drive, no matter how locked the doors, no matter how bright the street lights shine. It was a quiet evening in a small town on the outskirts of Texas, where the streets were narrow and lined with old, weathered houses, their porches sagging under the weight of years. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the sky a deep indigo streaked with the last traces of pink and orange. The air carried the scent of distant rain and the faint tang of river water from the creek that wound through the edge of town. A mother and her young daughter walked home from the grocery store. The girl, no more than 8, carried a small bag of candy, swinging it lightly as she chatted about school, friends, and the things she wanted for her birthday. The mother, though tired from work, smiled indulgently, listening and nodding, enjoying the simple joy of her child's chatter. They passed the creek, the water dark and calm, reflecting the dim glow of the moon. The mother didn't think twice about it. This had always been a peaceful place, quiet and safe. But some legends are never far from reality. As they walked, a faint, sorrowful sound drifted over the water. At first, it was almost imperceptible, like the whisper of the wind through reeds. Then it grew clearer, a low, mournful wail that seemed to pierce the quiet of the night. The girl paused, looking toward the creek with wide eyes. "Mommy, what's that sound?" The mother glanced over, scanning the dark banks of the water. Nothing, just the shadows of trees, swaying gently in the night breeze. "It's probably just someone crying," she said lightly, though a small, uneasy feeling settled in her chest. She picked up the pace, eager to reach the safety of their home. The crying grew louder, more desperate, almost as though it were calling to them. A chill brushed against her arms, and she pulled her jacket tighter around her. "It's just someone upset, honey. Let's keep walking." But the girl didn't move. Her small fingers gripped her mother's hand tightly. "No, Mommy, she's crying for help. I think she's lost." The mother frowned. The rational part of her mind struggled to explain it. There were no lights, no signs of people, but something instinctively told her to hurry. She pulled her daughter along, stepping off the edge of the path near the creek, just as the wail became louder, closer, more distinct. And then she saw her, a figure, pale as moonlight, with long, dark hair hanging in wet, tangled strands around a face that was almost too thin, too hollow, emerged from the shadows at the edge of the water. Her eyes were sunken, blackened around the rims, empty pools that seemed to stare straight into the soul. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, and then a wail that made the mother freeze, rooted in horror, clawing at the edges of sanity. "La Llorona," the girl whispered, barely audible, her voice trembling. She had heard the stories, of course, The old folktale whispered in hushed tones by grandparents of the woman who drowned her children in a fit of rage and sorrow, doomed to wander riverbanks forever, weeping and searching for more. But the stories had always felt distant, fairy tale warnings. Now, standing before them, it was real. The woman in the water reached toward them with thin, trembling hands, her motion fluid but unnatural, as if gravity and space bent around her. The mother screamed, dragging her daughter backward, stumbling onto the path. The figure didn't hesitate. She glided forward, feet hovering just above the ground, the wail of her mourning filling the night air like a physical force pressing against their chests. They ran, through the streets, down alleyways, past abandoned houses whose windows stared like dark eyes. They fled. But wherever they went, the wail followed. It didn't echo. It was direct, intimate, unrelenting. Every turn brought the sound closer, sharper. The air around them chilled, icy against their skin. The mother realized, with growing horror, that they weren't just being followed. They were being hunted. They reached their home and slammed the door, locking it behind them. The mother pressed her back against the door, clutching her daughter, trying to convince herself that they were safe. But the sound didn't stop. It was now at the edges of the house, outside the walls, a relentless wail that made the very foundation shiver. Desperate, she turned to the stories she had dismissed as a child. The books, the whispers La Llorona would take children, sometimes to replace the ones she had lost, sometimes in her eternal grief, sometimes simply to fill the void inside her endless sorrow. She thought of every tale she had ever heard. The woman at the river, the warning parents gave children to never wander alone near water after dark, the chilling notion that she could pass through walls and doors, unseen, patient, waiting. The nights that followed were a blur. Sleep came in short, terrified bursts, always punctuated by the faint, unmistakable sound of crying, soft at first, then closer, louder. Sometimes it seemed to come from the creek outside, other times from the very walls of their home. The mother installed locks, lights, alarms, anything that might protect them, but nothing could keep her away. La Llorona did not knock, did not ask permission. She was patient. She waited. The girl began to have nightmares. In her dreams, the river was always nearby, dark and deep, and the pale woman stood at its edge, waiting with empty eyes. The mother would wake, sweating and shaking, only to hear the faintest sound in the distance, the echo of her daughter's own words whispered back to her. "She's coming. She's coming." The mother reached out to neighbors, local elders, anyone who might know more about the legend. They told her fragments of old warnings. Leave offerings near rivers. Never wander alone at night. Always carry salt. Recite prayers, and never respond to crying alone. But the woman persisted, appearing in reflections, glimpsed from the corner of the eye, sometimes so close the air seemed to tremble around her. One night, the mother awoke to a sound at her bedroom window. The figure stood there, pale hands pressed against the glass, hair matted and dripping with water, eyes hollow and black. She couldn't scream. Her body refused to obey. The girl clutched her tightly, whispering that La Llorona had found them. And in that moment, she understood. There was no escape. La Llorona did not need doors, keys, or walls. She moved through grief itself, through fear, through the fabric of reality, patient, eternal, and relentless. Days turned into weeks. The mother and daughter began sleeping with lights on, river water and mirrors covered with charms and salt. Yet the crying never ceased, always present, a constant reminder that the woman in black could be anywhere. The town spoke quietly about them, offering sympathy and hushed warnings, but none dared venture near the creek at night, knowing that her gaze could linger on any child anywhere. And still La Llorona waits. by rivers, creeks, and lonely paths, at the edges of towns and in the dark corners of homes. She is a mother without children, a sorrow without end, an unstoppable force born from rage, grief, and eternal punishment. The story is not merely a warning. It is proof that some spirits cannot rest, that sorrow can become malevolent, that grief can grow into a hunger that stretches beyond life and death. For every child wandering near water at night, for every parent who turns a blind eye, she waits. And if you listen closely, you can still hear her wail, haunting the wind, calling for those who cross her path, patient, sorrowful, and terrifyingly eternal.